what are we called to? How are we structured? How has God created us in his
Yeah.
image and likeness? So God
Yeah.
created man and woman in his image and likeness. Therefore, both of us will reflect that image and likeness in our own unique and distinct ways.
We just need to be just present to him and not have him doing, talking, us talking. There's just that. I mean, that's the beauty of contemplative prayer, is that
Yes.
we're just in the present moment with him. So I think there's all kinds of incredible spiritual gifts that are just completely overlooked because we have gotten onto this idea of how our lives ought to look, and they're just awash with confusion about who we are.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Genius Podcast. My name is Karen Doyle, your host and founder of the Genius Project. The Genius Project is an initiative for Catholic women designed to support and resource you towards growth in all areas of your life, personal, spiritual, and professional. We seek to do this through the Genius Podcast, which you're listening to, our online courses and our Catholic coaching programs for women, as well as the Catholic Women's Masterclass, which is a 4-month masterclass. It's a journey of transformation to discover what it means to be a Catholic woman and how you can live a life of wholeness in Christ. If you'd like to find out about these initiatives, can I invite you to visit our website, www.geniusproject.co, and I'd love to invite you to come and join us on Instagram, genius_project_daily, and you can also watch the live recordings of these episodes on our Genius Project YouTube channel. Just make sure you hit subscribe so you can be notified every time a new episode drops. Well, on this week's episode of the Genius Podcast, we are diving into a very interesting topic, a topic that's going to take us back in time before we can move forward and see where we find ourselves in this unique moment in history and what we're being called to do to respond to those unique challenges. The question that we're talking about today is the impact of feminism. This can be quite a controversial topic, and my guest today is Dr. Carrie Gress, and she's going to be leading us through a conversation around how we trace the roots of feminism back to its origin through to the present day, and then what as Catholic women we can do to respond to some of the challenges and to, I guess, honor our unique dignity as women in the world today and the dignity of the men that we are called to do life alongside. So Carrie is the author of 10 books, and today we're going to be discussing her latest book, The End of Woman: How Smashing the Patriarchy Has Destroyed Us, which is a really interesting read. If you haven't got a copy, I encourage you to do so. There's a link in our show note. But Dr. Carrie Gress is a fellow at the Washington, D.C.-based think tank Ethics and Public Policy Center. She's a scholar at the Institute for Human Ecology at the Catholic University of America. Carrie has her doctorate in philosophy from the Catholic University of America, and she is the editor of the online women's magazine Theology of Home. She's the author of 10 books, she has 5 children, and she lives in the Virginia area in the United States of America. This is a really interesting conversation that has powerful ramifications for every woman, regardless of the sphere of life you find yourself in. So I encourage you to carve out some time and space for this episode of the Genius Podcast. I hope you enjoy. Well, Carrie, welcome back to the Genius Podcast. I'm very excited to have you joining us as a guest today, talking about your latest book, The End of Woman: How Smashing the Patriarchy Has Destroyed Us, and very, very excited to dive into this topic this morning. But welcome back.
Oh, thank you. It's really great to be here. It's always nice to be in Australia, even though I have never been there, but one
You've
of these
never
days,
been?
hopefully. I have never
Hopefully.
been. Yeah.
It's
It
a
feels
great
like
place.
a big gap in my travels, I think, for sure. I wanted to
Yeah.
go when I was in college, and I ended up going to Europe instead. So one of
Okay.
these days I'll get to Australia.
Because you've lived in Italy as well, haven't you?
Italy and Poland and France, actually. I've lived
Okay.
in those 3 European countries. So yeah.
Yeah. And well, you have to put Australia on the place of
I
things
know.
to do.
Absolutely.
A lot of
Absolutely.
Americans do come over in college. It seems to be a thing.
Mhm. Yeah, no, and I think that was, I mean, for me, it was a big thing just thinking about going, just being in a different country and having that opportunity to do it for
Mm.
several months at a time in sort of a protective kind of way, and you still get your classes and have that whole experience. But yeah, so I looked at Perth, actually, was one of the places I was looking
Did
at.
you?
But yeah, I ended up
Fantastic.
going to
Well,
France.
we're East Coast, not Perth. So you
Exactly.
have to come to
Yes.
East Coast if you
But
come
I
to
would love to
Australia.
come to the East Coast too. So it all looks
Yeah, it's
amazing.
very beautiful. We have some very beautiful beaches here in Australia.
I have heard. Is it Bondi Beach? Is that how you pronounce it?
Bondi, yes, Bondi
Bondi
Beach.
Beach.
Yes,
Yeah, I think
that's
I've
where all
read
the
it more
tourists
than,
go. Yeah.
yeah. So you probably know more about the better beaches where that aren't so touristy, I'm
Yes,
sure.
don't go to
So
Bondi Beach.
you can take me to the better beaches then.
All
How
right,
about
I'll
that?
take
That's
you when you
great.
come. Fantastic. Well, look, it's great
Perfect.
to have you back with us because last time you're on the podcast, we were discussing your book, Theology of Home, which is a beautiful exploration of just this theology of creating places and spaces where the human heart can flourish and people can feel loved and accepted.
Mhm.
And so it's a huge jump to go from Theology of Home to The End of Woman, how smashing the
Yeah.
patriarchy has destroyed us. So I'm interested in
Right.
what happened for you in between those
Mhm.
two books and what led you
Yeah.
to writing The End of Woman?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. Before I wrote Theology of Home, I wrote the book called The Anti-Mary Exposed. And in that book, in many respects, is much more similar to The End of Woman. And when I researched that book, I really realized, one of the ways in which the culture has been destroyed is through cultural things like magazines and books and talk shows and, all of those kinds of things that really have a very leftist bent, especially in the United States. I'm sure it's the same way in Australia.
Mhm.
It occurred to me, why are we not doing these kinds of projects, whether it's a coffee table book or a magazine or that kind of thing, as Catholics? Because Catholics always used to be so engaged in the culture, even
Yes.
Academy Awards. I mean, that's the movie Song of Bernadette. I think it was in the late 1940s, won several Academy Awards, and was Catholics were very active in the culture. And I think in the 60s, things really just went sideways. And this is where I know when I was growing up, it was a lot of felt banners, and that
Hmm.
was sort of a lot of rainbows, and
Yeah.
but nobody really appreciated culture. There was always kind of the sense of like, oh, you're just making money off of the church kind of
Hmm.
sensibility about people that were engaged in that kind of thing. And in the United States, we've got a lot of Christian bookstores and things like that, but they're not really lifestyle brands, or they don't really fit naturally into women's homes. And so that was one of the things that Theology of Home just felt like it was really needed for that. Like, if we're going to really start helping women understand their vocation, we have to help them see it in a beautiful way. And that's what we never see is, women who are living out their vocation in really compelling and attractive ways, instead of sort of awkward and kitschy, or, that
Yeah.
kind of thing. And when we came up with the idea for Theology of Home, the idea actually came to me on my treadmill, and then it just
As
sort of
where all good
exploded.
ideas come.
All good idea. I know.
Or the
Which is
shower,
always
or
a
the
great
shower.
reminder to me. Like, why do I not spend more time there? Because I've had a lot
That's
of
right.
great ideas there. But
Yeah.
in any event, but the key thing to the book was really making sure it had images in it, and that we hired an exceptional photographer. She lives in the LA area, and just had done incredible work. And it was such a privilege to work with her and to really make something very beautiful. And we now have 4 Theology of Home books.
Yes.
Noelle Maring and I have authored 3 of them, and one of them was done by our colleague Emily Malloy, who this one just came out. It's on flowers and the liturgical season, and
Okay.
um, gardening and whatnot. It's just gorgeous. But in any event, it's been really fun to sort of have a gift that people can give to just about anybody, and it's not going to you're not going to make people mad, and I think that, or people are just going to appreciate it for what it is, or it's, people put it in their guest rooms or coffee tables, and everybody sort of flips through it, I keep hearing. And so that was what really the goal of it was: how do we create something that people aren't going to pick up and suddenly feel like they either have to put down, or they can't put down because they're so engaged in it, which
Hmm.
I've heard that there's sort of 2 reactions to my book. So my book's the Anti-Mary, and then of course The End of Woman. So anyway, the Theology of Home is just this, I think, really great kind of universal book that is visually beautiful, but also has a lot of really rich content in it.
Mm.
And so so the two are actually not unconnected. They're very
Absolutely.
connected, but they're just
Yes.
very, different sides of the coin. And then the book, The End of Woman, I had been asked by people, can you write something like The Anti-Mary Exposed, but that can be for people that are Protestant or secular, or any woman or man could pick this up and still glean something from it.
Hmm.
And So that had been in the back of my mind, and of course, I couldn't just rewrite the previous book for legal reasons and otherwise. But so I had to do something different, and I knew that I had not spent enough time on first wave feminism. My research for the Anti-Marriage Exposed really stopped at 1960, and I didn't go back any further. And I really wanted to look into first wave feminism, and there were all kinds of things that I wanted to do in this book, but so that's really it's almost a prequel. If people have read the Anti-Marriage Exposed, this in certain respects is kind of a prequel to help understand more. But again, it's also coming at these issues from a very secular, non-sectarian kind of viewpoint. And that's been nice. It's been really fun to be able to talk to all kinds of people about this book, certainly outside of Catholic circles for sure.
Yes, yeah, and it's a great unpacking. Actually, what you've done really well is trace it back to its origins, this wave of feminism, and I guess the ideology that we find ourselves now in current culture so embedded in. Our children are marinating in some of these ideas and these concepts which are shaping so much. I mean, it's infiltrated all areas of church and institutions and politics and universities, education. So it's really important to understand, and I love history myself, and I love tracing things back to their origin and their roots, because then we can kind of see how things have evolved, and then we can better understand where we are uniquely positioned in our moment in history and what then we're called to do. Because I think one thing is very important, that as women, we all have a mission. In whatever sphere of influence we find ourselves in, we have a mission, we have a purpose. And so I think a part of that, obviously, Edith Stein talks about the layers of vocation. We have a universal call to love, and then we have our primary vocation, which we live out that universal call to love through either marriage, consecrated life, or the single life. But then we also have this individual vocation, what we are uniquely called to do. And I think sometimes as women, we forget, we can lose sight of, in being caught up in different elements of raising families or career, that we actually have an individual vocation and what that is. Now, I think it's very important to understand, I guess, the evolution of feminism and the moment of history we find ourselves in, so that we understand the unique role that we're called to play. So I love that you've traced feminism back to its origins. Would you give us a quick recap for women who aren't familiar, I guess, with the historical evolution of feminism? I mean, we're going back to the 1700s here in your book, which is fascinating. So can you give us a little bit of a summary? But I really encourage all women to go and read the book, a summary of those roots of feminism and I guess how we've evolved to where we are today.
Yeah, no, and this was actually one of the really surprising things about the book, because I didn't expect to be spending so much time on the first wave. I thought the first wave was really great and had a lot of rich content that I would be able to sort of pull good quotes from and say, this is what it should look like. Feminism should look like. And the more I dug, the more I realized that that was actually not the case, that all of the things that we see in second wave feminism really were already there, where the seeds were already there in first wave feminism. So there were three basic things that I kind of used to define feminism. I think that, the big question that I think all feminism has really asked, even if many women didn't realize this is what they were asking, but you can see this sort of, I think, as an arch over the whole movement, that brings a lot of clarity both to what was happening in the 1800s, but also to today, is really this question: how do we make women more like men? And when you start thinking through that question and applying that to each specific era, it makes sense of all of it in a way that I think you can get kind of stuck in the minutia sometimes. And so, so I just offer that as kind of just like a big picture. What are we kind of looking at here? And then there are three very specific things that I was able to pinpoint back in the 1810s, 1820s, that I think are constitutive of feminism even today. And the first thing is this idea of kind of restructuring society, which I now call smashing the patriarchy. So it's this idea of kind of getting rid of any kind of hierarchy, whether it's a church, whether it's monarchy, at that time was important to them, whether it's any distinctions and differences between male and female in terms of authority. So that's the first thing. The second thing was this idea of free love. How do we, the goal was really to get rid of marriage and monogamy and the nuclear family. And I think that's one of the more surprising things that people are like, what are you talking about? In the 1800s? Are you kidding? Like this, we think of it as very
And
prudish and
traditional.
Victorian. And
That's right.
yeah, and that's actually not true, or that's not the reality. I mean, it was kind of the wild, wild west in a lot of respects, especially after the Civil War in the United States. It was, culturally, things were really a hot mess. So that was another piece, was this free love idea. And that's brewing in Paris with the Marquis de Sade. I mean, he's the father of sadism. He's trying to get rid of all kinds of taboos. You've got William Godwin, who was actually the husband of Mary Wollstonecraft, who she's considered the first feminist. He was very much against monogamy and against marriage, and thought it was a kind of slavery for women. So this was just an idea that was really bubbling up, and then was carried forward, to a lot of the later feminists and the suffragettes in the United States. Some people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. And then the third piece is the occult, and this is another.
That surprised me.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
me too. And it was really interesting. I found this book called Satanic Feminism. It was written by a Swedish man. It was published by Oxford University Press. And this book just, I mean, so it wasn't slouchy. This wasn't something I found on the internet or something. This was very well
Credible.
documented. Yeah, incredible scholarship done on this. And this gentleman did so much work, and everything from seances and mediums and all the different women that were involved in that, all these religions that we would sort of call New Age religions, even though that wasn't the term that they used, but it was sort of this cobbled together cultic Wicca, all that kind of channeling the dead, all of those kinds of elements were very much involved. And in fact, Elizabeth Cady Stanton actually sat at a table and got the idea for her Seneca Falls convention at one of these rapping tables, which were very popular in New York State after the Civil War. It was, these spirits would sort of knock on them and give people ideas somehow. Anyway, and it was really interesting period of time because, things are really in flux. You had things like electricity. People are just beginning to understand electricity, and so they're thinking of mediums and seances sort of in the same terms as electricity and the dynamism that's coming with, sharing currents of power and all of that. So anyway, it was really interesting to dig into it. But yeah, these three pieces just continue to cycle through. And the fascinating thing too, I think, without going and getting too deep in the details, is just to see how flexible feminism was as a brand. It was able to maneuver and sort of fit. I call it a brand actually in the book. I think of it like a Nike or something. Where it was able to sort of reinvent itself. So at one point, it's very focused on sort of the suffrage temperance movement. It can work in with that kind of language, and then you move forward to the early 1900s, and suddenly the Marxists want the feminists under their umbrella. And then you move forward again, and you've got the new left of the 1960s. And so it's really, and I think even now, the bigger issue is the trans movement has kind of taken it on. In fact, we would never have the trans movement. We would never have woke ideology if it was not for feminism. Feminism really laid the foundation for those. But even the Barbie movie, I think, is just another way in which feminism is trying to appeal to a different generation. I mean, Barbie was sort of scorned by most feminists in the 1970s and 80s, and suddenly,
absolutely,
yeah, she's an icon. And I think it's because feminists and elite women are realizing that we got to change this, because women are beginning to sort of reject that girl boss brand, that girl boss attitude, and things are softening, clothing is softening. I mean, even now, I'm amazed that you can buy long dresses. I mean, for most of my life, you could never buy a long dress. You could never find a long dress that was suitable. So it's really interesting to sort of see these trends in clothing and branding and the ideas, and but how pervasive they are, and how much we as women have absorbed it and just kind of taken it on as second nature.
I'm interested in what surprised you. You touched on the area of the occult, but were there any
Yeah.
surprises when you started digging that really stood out for you? I mean, you've obviously been tracking this for a while. You're
Yeah.
involved at university and you've got your PhD. So you're
Right.
across all of it. But when you really
Yeah.
started digging and plowing through this information, what really stood out for you or surprised you?
I mean, there's so many things. I think they certainly just even how bad the first wave of feminism was. That was probably the biggest thing because again, I think certainly in the United States, there's a sense that the first wave was good and the second wave is bad, and we can use the first wave. And so for me to go back and start seeing like, no, we don't want to use these ideas of the first wave. They're just as problematic as the second wave. That was really surprising. But I think the thing that continues to astound me is just how successful it's been and how much women we just don't know these details. We don't know this kind of content. We still have this sense that feminism has been this very benevolent friend that, it's sort of like this grandmother that has led us to be able to be educated and to vote and to
Mm,
have opportunities. And that's kind of how we view it, instead of really realizing that there's just this incredible amount of rot around it that has damaged the culture severely. It's damaged women severely. Even, there's all the metrics show women are less happy after
mhm,
feminism than they were before feminism. Even the abortion issue obviously is huge. And I think especially as Catholics, we don't really connect the dots there and realize it's feminism that has created the space for women to be able to consciously and um, even emotionally separate that bond between us and our children, and say abortion has to happen. And it's
mm,
because the career piece has become such a focus in our minds. And we can talk about that more, because I think
mm,
that really plays into the Marxism that has taken over feminism. But I think it's just astounding especially when you realize, feminism really is the deadliest ideology in all of human history. I
mm.
think that last year's metrics for abortions in 2023 was 44 million abortions worldwide. Let that
Oh,
sink in. 44 million.
yeah.
That is more than every other cause of death combined and all the other people combined. That's like 10 million more.
Yeah.
And that is all because we've been told that we have to be able to compete with men, and our children are an obstacle to that. And you can't build human or female happiness on that when you
Mm,
are saying what we're made for.
mhm,
It's in our bodies so deeply. When that is not the real purpose of our life, that's really where you're going to create this disconnect. And this is why women aren't happy, because we're telling women that something that is not part of their nature is what is going
mhm,
to fulfill them, and denying what is part of their nature and saying that's not going to fulfill them.
mm.
So it's just
Yeah.
everything's been turned on its head by it.
It has. And you're making a good point. I'd love to go a little bit deeper with this because I think this is so important. You touch on this
Hmm.
disconnect, like of a woman
Hmm.
and what she's doing, this
Hmm.
separation from what she's doing to who she is, who she's being.
Yeah.
And I think
Yeah.
feminism obviously has split those two
Hmm.
things, and we can't do
Yes.
that because they are intricately connected. Edith Stein talks about this
Yeah.
theology of womanhood, which then John Paul II built further
Yeah.
upon, that our biological nature actually informs, inspires, designs, orients our entire personality and how we live our lives. And obviously, there's a huge spectrum from women who
Hmm.
are incredibly feminine to women who don't feel as feminine. But
Hmm.
that sense of who we are, the fact that we have a womb, shapes and structures our personality in a unique way to be
Hmm.
person-centered. I think what
Yeah.
feminism does, it does split that, doesn't it? It comes in
Yeah.
and it makes that split between who a woman is, her being, and what she does. And
Mhm.
I'd love to go a little
Yeah.
bit deeper with that in a moment.
Mhm.
I want to touch on, as we start to progress this conversation, around this idea of, is there any good in feminism? Because on
Mhm.
the surface, people who haven't read your book or who don't understand its roots and its origins, and I guess
Yeah.
the trajectory of feminism, where it will ultimately take us, you can look at
Mhm.
this movement of feminism. Even John Paul II said that a movement was needed to
Mhm.
advance, I guess, the dignity of women. But
Right.
what you're saying is feminism wasn't actually trying to help women be better women. It was trying to
Yeah.
turn them into men. And John Paul
Yeah.
II also talks about that distinction when he separates feminism. He calls a new and an old feminism. Now, you and
Mhm.
I can talk
Mhm.
about whether that word feminism should even be used, but
Right.
he was encouraging women away from this idea that we have to be like men. He
Yeah.
encourages us to
Yeah.
tap
Very
into
explicitly.
our feminine genius. What are the unique qualities and attributes that make us a woman? And let's maximize those and find our
Yeah.
place. I want to come back to this idea that, like, this question of, is feminism good? Didn't it do good for women? What are
Mhm.
your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So this is a big question. I think is really an important one, and I think that it's only more recently that I've actually gotten to the point where I've said it's done more damage than it has done good. And again, because I think it distorts our nature. It's tried to change our nature and change us into something that we are not. Now, this is not to say that I'm not grateful for my education or for my capacity to vote or all of those things. But the real problem is that we have had, and this is actually one of the ways in which feminism has sort of protected itself from criticism is
Mm-hmm.
by this kind of guilt that it elicits in us. And you hear this all the time, like, how dare you say something negative when you have a doctorate or whatever that argument may be. But we don't do this with any other ideology. We don't do this in any other way. If there's a real problem, then you have to actually address it and look at it and
Mm-hmm.
and face it and air it out. And so yeah, I think that there's the real problem is we haven't said anything good about being a woman as mother. And when I say mother, I don't mean, I mean that sort of in this in the sense that you mean with Edith Stein, that it's a spiritual and psychological reality too. It's not just a
Mm-hmm.
biological, giving
That's right.
birth, but there are bigger pieces to it. It's a much larger term. But we've destroyed the culture by in this in a way in which was not necessary, because there natural law and the basic idea of educating children. I mean, a lot of these things that we see today are very commonsensical and could have very easily come about without bringing in Marxist ideology and the new left and abortion and really telling women and refocusing women to really believe that they're meant first and foremost to work, instead of to be a woman and it be maternal in the many different ways in which you can do that, whether it's
Mm.
at home or in the workplace or as a religious or this bigger spectrum. And I think too, you've mentioned several times this great distinction between what a woman does and what a woman is. And you can see just this burst of problems that happen with that, because if women are just what they do, then this is how you open the door to allowing men to be women too. Because if they can do the same things that women can do, then where's the distinction? And you get, you bleed, you just open that door to all kinds of relativism and
Mm-hmm.
significant problems, without really underscoring what a woman is. And, this is our problem today.
Which
We
is
don't know
our
how
big
to
question,
say,
isn't it? I
yeah,
mean, it's
we don't know how to define womanhood because
which is
it's been
ludicrous
so,
right there.
yeah, it really is. It really is, especially because it's not really that hard of a question. But when you tell women for 50 years that motherhood is bad or it's optional, it's not really constitutive of who you are, despite the fact that your body is sort of rife with these clues that you are meant to mother others, then this is going to create this significant kind of confusion.
Mm.
And while we're simultaneously really putting on a pedestal all the things that men do, so this kind of, I love the idea of empowering women and giving them opportunities, but not if that means they just mimic men. And that's really what I think feminism has done, and where the real
Mm.
damage is in trying to shift and change and contort our human nature to meet something that is an impossible, it's an idol, really. It's an impossible thing to
Yes.
achieve.
And can I jump in there when you
Yeah.
said mimicking men? I think it's also, it can't be done at the expense of our primary vocation. And I see
Yeah.
this a lot
Yeah.
in coaching women. They come to me and I do a lot of this coaching, and there's this disconnect and this interior struggle between working
Mhm.
and being a mum. And
Yeah.
they just,
Yeah.
there's this constant war within a woman
Yeah.
when she's
It's
trying
really
to
hard.
be on that hustle treadmill and also mother her family. Now, I'm not
Mhm.
saying that it's either or, but the
Mhm.
pursuit of career cannot be done at the expense of
Yeah.
our primary vocation as a wife and mother. And I think that's very
Yeah.
important. We're told that
Mhm.
we can do it all. We're told we can have
Yeah.
it all. But the reality in women's
Yeah.
lives, and I tell you because I coach hundreds of women, the reality is
Yeah.
they can't do it all. They're falling apart. They're so stressed. They're miserable.
Yeah.
Husbands are unhappy because there's this internal conflict that then spills over into their marriage. Mothers are
Mhm.
short-tempered, they're short-fused, they've got no time.
Yeah.
And I watch it with my children. Like, there's so many children that they're mixing with at school whose parents don't have time to parent anymore because
Yeah.
they're pursuing something else. So
Yeah.
it really is
Yeah.
a huge problem, isn't it? And I think this is one of the primary things that we want to acknowledge, that women, yes, we can have an education, we can be in the workplace, and we can do all of those things. We just have to balance it very carefully in terms of that
Yeah.
godly order, that we have this
Mhm.
structure of, I often like to think of this pyramid of priorities, and at the top is, and I filter everything through this, vocation to love. How am I loving? How am I showing up for people in general? My primary vocation, how am I showing up as wife and mother? And then my work. And if
Yeah.
that pyramid is not in that godly order, then we do get that tension happening.
Mhm.
So I think it's really
Yeah.
important just to acknowledge that, yes, women should be and are called to be in all spheres of culture. There are single women, women in consecrated life, married women, mothers, who bring to the table something unique because of their experience. But as John Paul
Mhm.
II says in Mulieris Dignitatem, it is women who are filled with the spirit of the gospel that will do so much to aid humanity in not falling. And what we see in feminism is that total death denial of a spirit of the gospel. And so we have
Mhm.
what we have today because we don't have women who are stepping into these spheres of influence filled with the spirit of the gospel, which is informing their decisions and how they're carrying out, I guess, their duties.
Yeah, no, so well said. It's really just could sit and listen to you for a long time, actually. Keep going.
No,
Um,
no, you're
but no, I think you're exactly right. And one of the things that's really missing, I just got a letter recently from a Carmelite nun, and it was beautiful. It was, it's one of those letters that just makes you cry and makes you, all
Mm,
the all the hard challenges really worth it. But she said she was from a very Catholic family, very devout family. She became a nun, and it took her 9 years to really figure out and understand receptivity. And it's a
mm,
fascinating thing because, of course, she knows she's in relationship with God, so she knows her spouse is perfect. So all the problems and struggles that she has are on her. This is, I think, something that nuns have that advantage because they know it's got to somehow be reflected in them. And she wrote and explained that she loved my book because it suddenly made sense of why it was such a struggle for her to figure out this capacity to be receptive, to surrender, to be open, and
mm,
allow God to plant seeds in our lives. And I think this is one of the things that's really hard for all of us because feminism has been really promoting this sense of power and control. And we can control our careers in a much more dynamic and tactile way than we can. Have we met the man that we want to marry? Will we have children? How many children will we have? Like all of those questions that are more relational and aren't dependent upon us. We can't make
mhm,
these things materialize just out of will the way that we can, maybe sort of by putting our resumes out and, doing the hard work of building a career. It just feels like the harder you work, the better the results. But that isn't always manifest itself or work out that way in a family dynamic and with the
mhm,
relationships of family. So I think that's something we also have to be really mindful of as Catholic women is understanding that some of these things that are passed down, I know, especially to our daughters, is it feels much easier to just say, oh, I'm going to be this kind of woman and I want this kind of career and, sort of let the rest of it sort itself out.
mhm,
Um, but there's a danger in that because again, like as you mentioned, you miss that fundamental capacity of receptivity and that kind of gift that is meant to be given everywhere, in no matter what the vocational specific
mm.
call is. So
Yeah.
yeah, I think that's really an important piece for people to sort through.
Yes, it is. I know we have, we have three teenagers at the moment, and obviously they're starting to look at career pathways and all of that sort of thing. And my husband, Jonathan, is really big on, before we talk about career pathway, looking at, I guess, vocation, like starting to help
Yeah,
them, embedding that idea of vocation. It's not just about doing and following a career
yeah,
trajectory, while that might be the way they go and is important, but what are they called to? And I think
yeah,
this is the important thing when we're talking about feminism and being Catholic women in the world today. Just going a little bit deeper, what are we called to? How are we structured? How has God created us in his
yeah,
image and likeness? So God created man and woman in his image and likeness. Therefore, both of us will reflect that image and likeness in our own unique and distinct ways. And I think the danger, and you've picked up on this in your book, is what feminism did was try and turn women into men. And so, in a sense, we're erasing those differences, we're denying them completely. And we're saying that this is in the name of equality, but equality doesn't mean sameness. Like, we can still have equality, this complementarity and difference. Can you speak a little bit into that for a moment on this idea of just what I see as this erasing of womanhood? And this is the trajectory of feminism, of where we're going, and it's startling to think we're erasing these differences at what cost and to what end?
No, and I think that that is a really great question. And one of the things I think about a lot, I just heard a reflection for Lent by Tammy Peterson, who's Jordan Peterson's wife. And I ended up, I listened to this. I had dropped my girls off at school and I was driving home and I listened to this reflection and I just immediately sat down and started writing because she's in it. She's describing kind of this miraculous healing that she's had and why she's becoming Catholic. But she's explaining how at one point she's talking to her son. She's telling him that she's going to die. She's got this 10-month, the diagnosis is such that she won't live more than 10 months. And she's telling him this. And she said she saw in his face this kind of love for her where she realized that he loved her more than she loved herself. And just, the pain that was there, but just this deep, deep love. And she also, kind of through that saw reflected in it the love that God has for her too. And she said this immediately, this weight was taken off of her shoulders, which is really hard for me to imagine because it feels like that would be worse weight, heavier. But she said it brought her this sort of epiphany of sorts where she realized God's love. And she said to her son, this diagnosis is made by a man. It wasn't made by God. So we're going to just take it one day at a time and be grateful and, be together as a family and do what we can through this. And, it really just was one of those moments where I was listening to her speak. And I think we all kind of have this experience in different ways. I know I've had it in different times of my life, but where you meet a woman and you're like, I just want to listen to you talk. I feel like there's so much wisdom coming from you. There's so many insights, and there's a depth there, and there's a care there, and there's a deep relationship that's kind of an intersubjective relationship, where it's the two people are kind of like she sees me and I see her kind of thing. You're being seen. And it's that kind of very specifically maternal love that I think Tammy Peterson was expressing and in such a way that showed her being wise and caring and prudent and patient, all of these kinds of virtues. And we just don't see them in the world today, where there's so much flash and there's so much flesh and there's so much busyness that when you really see this in a woman, you just want more of it. And we're longing for maternal love, and it's that's really the piece that's missing. And I think there's so many of the problems and the neuroses and the issues that we have in the culture are because that piece was not given to people. There's a great work by Erica Commissar, who's a psychoanalyst here in the United States, and she's written this book called Being There. And she says, what's been taken from women is this capacity for empathy for their children. And I think that just like that, those words just sort of stopped me in my tracks when I heard her say that, because I think that's really the key is women have been told that they're a victim and that we've sort of turned in upon ourselves and that, the family and children and whatnot is for the victimizing us. And so this is what we have to get out of and free
that's
ourselves from.
Marxism, isn't it? That's Marxism.
It is. It's absolutely
the oppressed
Marxism.
and the oppressor. Yeah.
Through and through. That's exactly right. And so that's what Marxism, that's what feminism, that's what, this ideology has taken from us really is this maternal kind of love and these very unique expressions that come from different women that, we have these experiences where we get to see it. Some of us are blessed with amazing moms and wonderful women around us who live this out, but it doesn't happen all the time. And I think it can be very challenging. In fact, it was funny. I was thinking about it this morning when I had four children very quickly together, and I remember when they were all very small and I would go to the grocery store with them. I would get so frustrated because, there would be all these older women who they would be annoyed and sigh because it would
Yes.
take me a long time to get my kids in the
Yeah.
cart, and I would be so frustrated because I would just think, you are the women that are supposed to be helping me, because I didn't have family around. I didn't have
Mm-hmm.
close friends. I didn't have a nanny or anything. And I just, I would leave the grocery store sort of seething, like, these are
Yeah,
the people that are supposed to be helping me and mentoring me and showing
that's
me how to
right.
be a mom and care for me, instead of like all of this sort of like condescension and bitterness and all
Mm-hmm.
of that. And so anyway, and then when you're around someone who's older who does those things for you, it just is
Mm.
this balm for the soul. And you realize,
Isn't it?
like,
Yeah.
this is what we need. We need this kind of love, this kind of mentoring, this kind of patience, this kind of,
Mm.
uh,
Space
demonstrating
and
how,
time.
yeah, all
Yeah.
of that, all of those things, all of
And our
those things. So
culture
that's really,
doesn't allow us that time anymore. Like it's just
no,
so fast, so busy. And
no,
technology has taken that, the digital revolution has taken that to a whole
for
new
sure.
level where we
Yeah.
don't have time and space. And I remember once
Yeah.
one of my kids said, I'm bored, I'm bored. Well, this is really good to be bored.
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
there's a
And
sense of
yeah, and I
filling
think
every space, isn't there?
it's that. And I think also, one of the biggest lessons I had to learn as a mother was that sometimes my kids just need me to hold them. And I think, when they're small, you want to do that. You want to just
Yeah.
sit and hold them because they smell good and they're so sweet and they're
Yeah.
sleeping. And but it gets harder when they're older, and you feel like you need to do more for them. And that's been one of the biggest lessons. Like, right now, this child just needs me to just be present with
Hmm.
them, whether
Yeah.
it's I'm just talking with them, I'm holding them, we're watching a show together, something. They just need that physical contact and that kind of sense that I'm just with them. And that's absolutely something that I never. I mean, it was only a lot of trial and error that I learned that. It wasn't that I read it in a book, or it was very much because my natural instinct would be to just be busy and to keep
Yes.
doing. And
Yeah.
and so I think that was an incredible lesson too, in terms of and that's how God works too. I mean, this is
Hmm.
the beautiful, sometimes we just need to be just present to him and not have him doing talking, us talking. There's just that. I mean, that's the
Mm.
beauty of contemplative prayer, is that
Yes.
we're just in the present moment with him. So yeah, I think there's all kinds of incredible spiritual gifts that are just completely overlooked because we have gotten onto this idea of how our lives ought to look, and they're just awash with a lot of confusion about who we
Mm.
are.
Mm. What would you say, Carrie, to the woman whose heart and desire is to be at home with her children, but feels the
Mhm.
pressure to return to the workplace? What are your
Mhm.
thoughts for that woman?
Yeah, I mean, I guess in a certain respect, the hard question is always that balance of, like, people have to pay the bills and
Yes.
those kinds of
Yeah.
things. I would say, but the key thing is that your children are never going to be small again. You can all, there's always really that capacity to earn money later. But they can never be small again. And they don't have, financially, there's not huge expenses when they're tiny. There's not tuition and things like that when they're tiny. It's actually daycare, which is the bigger thing. And I think that there's I would say listen to that. Listen to what the heart's desire is, because it's also what is best for the child. I mean, this is what the research is showing, is that the how important it is to be close to your child, especially for those first 3 years. And this is obviously not to guilt anyone in this situation. I mean, there's so many challenging situations, and I guess this is the beauty of the church, is that the church isn't saying you have to do it X way. I mean, this is the
Hmm.
beauty of being in a marriage and discerning with your husband and with God and all of your variables, and sort of sorting through what's going to be the best thing for us. But I think that big X factor that really kind of trumps so much is that this time is not going to come back. This time in which their characters are formed and their personalities are formed, and
Mm.
all of their needs can be met by a mother. That's not going to come back. And not only, if you don't have that foundation when they're young, it gets much harder on all kinds of levels when they're older too.
Mm.
So it's just that kind of magic window that I think we really have to pay attention to, and that's really the desire that's there. And I have a lot of deep sympathy, because I know the kinds of pressures that women feel Even just like, when are you going back to work? The sort of casual questions that
Mm.
everybody sort of seems to be asking at the playground and that kind of thing. But I think there's so much reward in when we are able to stay home and be present as long as we can. And it comes back in spades in the kind of relationship you have with your children as well. So
Mm.
yeah, I
Yeah.
think it's hard, but it's an incredible gift. And
Mm.
looking at it that way instead of looking at it as something laborious or arduous. And I actually have written a book on this. This idea of what virtues come to us when we are mothering our children. And it took me a long time to figure this out. Like, these are being a mom is challenging because it's scrubbing from us our own narcissism. And I
Mhm.
sort of kept waiting, like, next week will get easier, next week will be easier. And finally I was like, wait,
This
it's
is
not
it.
supposed to get easier. This is what's supposed to happen so that I can be less selfish.
Yeah. Yeah.
And as soon as I figured that out, it was suddenly it became much, much easier, because I
Yeah.
realized these areas hurt because of my own vice and my own self-absorption. And if I can work through that, then I have so many more, I'm developing virtue, which is
Mm.
going to serve me in any capacity in the future.
Yeah.
And I know that, my ability to write books and to get them finished, so much of that has to do with perseverance that I learned from my children, and
Motherhood.
just the constancy it took to being a mother. So it's really interesting to see how God uses those kinds of
Yes.
challenges to then instill in us something that we wouldn't have had, we couldn't have really gotten
Mm.
otherwise, or it could have been much more challenging otherwise.
And I love that you pick up there on there's a fundamental mindset shift that you
Mhm.
articulate there in motherhood. And I think in light of your book and our discussion today, it's good for women to just reflect on, like, how am I being impacted, or how have I been impacted by feminism and the ideologies that I'm swimming in, day out? And how
Yeah.
does that then show up in terms of how I'm showing up in my marriage or my
Mhm.
workplace or in parenting or in consecrated life? Because even people living consecrated life can be
Yeah.
impacted by these
Hugely.
ideologies. And I think
Yeah.
it's a really
Hugely.
important question for women to reflect on, because I think if we're solid in our faith and we're practicing Catholics, we can think, oh no, I'm not impacted by that. But the
Mhm.
truth is, we can't help but not be impacted by it because we're just
Yeah.
swimming in this
It's
culture at the
everywhere.
moment. So
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think a question to pose for women today is, how have you been impacted by
Mhm.
feminism in a
Mhm.
positive and a negative way? And then to sit
Mhm.
before the Lord in the Blessed Sacrament and really ask the Holy Spirit to show you the ways in which that is shaping your
Yeah.
value, how you perceive your own value, but how you're showing up in your vocation as a woman in whatever sphere that is. And then going one step further, I think, and asking the Holy Spirit to reveal what are the mindset shifts that I need to
Mhm.
have so that I'm firmly rooted in the gospel and I'm showing up as a godly Catholic woman in the world
Yeah.
today. I think it's
Yeah.
very important. And I love that you articulate that mindset shift that you had about seeing the struggles of motherhood and not falling into bitterness and resentment, but saying, okay, how is the Lord using this pressure, this suffering, this challenge to make me into a saint? Because that is the whole point of our
Yeah.
lives as Christians, is our journey
Mhm.
towards sainthood.
I think this is a really important question. And part of the reason why I think it's so important is that I've actually had priests say things to me like, can you start mentioning this, or can you start mentioning that? Because we don't feel like we can really say anything. And I know
Mm.
in particular, one priest, who's actually well known, he said, there's this young woman that she's single and she wants to get married, and she can't figure out why she can't find a nice man. And he said, I could never tell her this, but the key piece is she doesn't understand how abrasive and how aggressive and assertive that she is. And, this is near and dear to my heart because I was that young woman. And, it really took a lot of soul searching because nobody was talking about this. This wasn't really something that was talked about when I was going through the stage before I was married. And I was just doing what the culture had told me and felt like this is how I had to sort of present myself as a successful, smart, savvy woman, kind of keeping up with the rest of the culture, and not realizing that I was actually doing, not I was doing considerable harm to myself, but also within that that dynamic. And I think that's something that we have to really pay attention to is, what are these subtle ways that the culture tells us we have to be, when maybe we don't have to be that way. Maybe there's times when we need to be more quiet, or maybe there are times when we need to be more supportive of those around us. And I think the saddest thing that we see in the church today is that because women have been so outspoken, a lot of times priests will not say what they ought to say. And and I have a lot of sympathy for priests. I'm not trying to point fingers. I think it's a very hard thing. I think feminism has shut down all men, not just priests. But I think in light of that, if you look at the major like key political issues in the United States in particular, and I know it's the same issues in Australia, what are those issues? It's abortion, and it's IVF, and it's contraception, these kinds of pieces that we don't really talk about in the church. In fact, most Catholics are contracepting and aborting and using IVF at the same rates as the secular culture. And I think, again, this is one of those areas where we have done ourselves a disservice because we have been so aggressive and outspoken in terms of saying this is a women's issue. You can't talk about this. You're sexist if you do. And I've seen women say that, Catholic women in particular, say that if they get any pushback to their position, then there is going to be fallout for them. We're going to see that. And I think that this is just a really a hard thing because we've been so trained to sort of stand up for ourselves and feel that we have to be outspoken, but it's been used in a really damaging kind of way. And that's something that I think all of us really have to be, mindful of is, am I being supportive to those around me? And am I being supportive of church teaching? Am I making people feel that they can, really seek and search out for the truth and speak the truth? Or is this something that we have to, sort of hedge away from, because we might get trounced by by people
Yeah.
that don't agree with us.
Yeah.
So that's a real challenge too, I think.
Okay. No, it is. And as you're speaking there and you're talking about that priest, I'm interested in coming back to this idea of the patriarchy, because
Hmm.
it's another idea that's really infected so much of our culture and our kids. My son
Yeah.
literally came home from school, International Women's Day. He goes to an all boys Catholic high school. And he said, why, when they are trying to help us understand the value of women, do they have to make us feel so bad about being male?
Mm.
And I thought,
Yeah.
wow,
Yeah.
you're young
Yeah.
and you can perceive that this is
Got it.
wrong, that we are
Yeah.
elevating women, but we're doing it at the expense of
Yeah.
masculinity. And we do
Yeah.
have to acknowledge that there are men in the world who behave terribly, and they
Mhm.
do oppress women. They have hurt women. Women have
Yeah.
suffered greatly at the hands of men at times throughout history.
Mhm.
And if that has been women's experience, then, I'm so sorry that it has been your experience. But you also have to say that not all men are like that. There are many, many
Mhm.
good men in the world. And what breaks my heart is just those good men are being pushed to the sidelines and silenced, and they're not valued for their unique contribution. I think that is a great tragedy, and I think that's evil that we
Yeah.
have. If we're going to promote women, we cannot do it at the expense of men. There has
Yeah.
to be this coming alongside, really, in terms of pushing each other forward and championing the unique gifts in
Mm.
each other. I remember many years ago, we have a movement here called the Young Men of God movement, and my husband and I would speak at the conferences. And many years, I think it was for about 10 years in a row, they asked me to come and give insights into understanding women. And they thought that it wasn't possible, but we educated them over that time, and they did come to understand women. But I remember at one of the conferences standing at the back of the room, and it was such a beautiful sight to behold. There was like hundreds of men facing the opposite direction to where I was standing, and they're all worshiping God. And I thought, oh,
Mm.
this is just the power of that masculinity. And it was so
Yeah.
beautiful. But I felt the Holy Spirit say to me, these men are only half of the picture. For the full picture
Mm.
to be realized, women need to come alongside these men, and men need to
Yeah.
come alongside these women for the picture to be
Mhm.
complete. And we get this
Mhm.
tension when men or women are
Yeah.
pushing ahead of each other, but there's an
Mm.
art to learning to do life alongside one another. And I think so many of our problems come in relationships, in marriages, because we don't know how to do the coming alongside piece.
Mhm.
Have you
Yeah.
got any thoughts there about how, as women, we can come
Mhm.
alongside men in a way that really values and esteems them rather than
Mm.
putting them down?
Yeah, I think that's so beautifully said. And one of the things that has really struck me even recently, I haven't really even written about it though, is just to see how much the problem is that men have been belittled, and they don't understand that their own manhood. And many times, this is something a father has to give to his son. This is something that has to be brought about by a family member or by other men, for a man to really know what his manhood is. And if that hasn't been gifted to him, and then he gets married, and it's very easy for women to sort of crush the authority of a man, especially in our own culture, that's so where women are really supposed to be in control. And we also have a lot of very competent women who don't, their first instinct is really mothering others. So what ends up happening more often, or so frequently, is that a woman starts to feel like her husband is just another child, and that she's mothering him. And it's amazing because we're not called, mother and husband. We're called husband and wife. And it's a completely different relationship to be in with someone as a spouse instead of as a mother. And I think this is one of the real tragedies, and why some of the reasons why so many marriages are failing or so difficult is this dynamic where a
Mhm.
man doesn't see his space or where he's meant to be, and a woman sort of fills it up, and it just ends up being this sort of like the same side of a magnet, like repulsing each other, what's the word I want, like deflecting each other.
Yes.
Whereas a good marriage that understands that complementarity and really understands men have that very clear purposes. It's protect, provide, and procreate. When those things are honored and really valued, when he's really respected, and that dynamic is alive, and she's very respected for her gifts and her capacities, then it's the sides of the magnets are working together and attracting each other, and it's creating this sort of cycle of vulnerability and trust, that is so important for a beautiful and healthy marriage, especially in light of the fact that a woman becomes most vulnerable in a marriage, especially when she's pregnant. Pregnancy is just automatic vulnerability, and there are few things as vulnerable as a woman who's about ready to give birth, who has just given birth, she and her
Yeah.
child. And that's not something that we do because it's done. We do it because within the context of a family, because there's someone else there to provide for us. I mean, ideally, there's extended family to help, and all these other factors. But
Mm.
this is one of the great challenges, is that we've kind of sloughed off the idea of the family, and now women are doing so many things that they never should have been doing on their own. And this is
Yeah.
the real challenge that we've created. So
Mm.
anyway, I think it's hopeful because those pieces are already there. It's just sort of a matter of unearthing them within our own hearts and the hearts of our husbands, and sort of putting things in right order, and kind of
Yes.
brushing off a lot of vices and trying to polish up the virtues, and
Mm.
in terms of creating a completely different marriage, looking at things differently.
Yeah, amen. And I think spending a lot more time just in prayer and asking those questions, like reflecting, asking the Holy
Mhm.
Spirit, because when we do self-reflection on our own, it becomes neurotic. When we do it with the Holy Spirit, that leads towards our growth and our transformation in life, and it's so
So
important.
well
And
said.
I
So
just think
true.
it's really want to encourage women to just go before the Lord in the Blessed Sacrament, but to carve out some time and space to ask some of these really important questions, because I think
Mhm.
you touch on something that's very important there, that when men sometimes don't know their role and they get pushed to the side, and women do fill that vacuum very quickly. I mean, I am tend to be an overachiever, so I can overfunction for people,
Yeah.
especially in the family. And so it's
Yeah.
been something that I've had to work on and just come before the Lord and say, okay, there is always in our life when we have a gift, and the qualities of femininity are a gift. So we might say maternity, receptivity, sensitivity, generosity. There's the
Mhm.
redeemed side of that, but there we have to understand there is the unredeemed side of every gift. So
Right.
for me, I have a big capacity. I'm a very resilient person. That's a gift that carries us through certain challenges. But I have to always hold that in balance with the unredeemed potential of that, and bringing
Yeah.
it before the Lord. So I think for women, it's really important, and there's an invitation for all women to not be thinking that they're doing it all correctly.
Mm.
The husband's possibly doing it incorrectly, but to have the humility to come before the Lord and that receptivity before Him to say, okay, how can I show up better? How can I be more conformed to your image as a woman? I think it's so
And
important.
I think that's such a great point too, because we naturally are going to have those areas that are going to be a challenge for us. I'm sure
Hmm.
women are hearing things that you and I are saying, and it's really setting off interior like angst. And
Yeah.
I think that that's just such a great sign of take that to prayer, and actually it's funny. I've gotten into the habit of every time I do um, I'm giving a talk publicly, I will give women my personal email address and say, you are more than welcome to email me if you think I'm wrong about any of this, but you are not allowed to do it until you have spent time in prayer and
Mm.
praying about this very specific, whatever it is that's bothering you. And I have yet to have somebody email me an issue from something that I've said. And I think it's not that I'm saying everything perfectly, but I think there's something that happens when you do take these things to prayer and you start seeing, oh, this is a brokenness, or oh, this is a way in which God wants to heal me. This is a way God wants to gift this, not just to me, but to our whole family,
Mm.
by make these subtle shifts. And usually those shifts are things that bring us great peace.
Hmm.
They bring order, and they bring um, just a very different kind of dynamic to the family than
Mm.
what had been happening previously. And it's very beautiful to start seeing these small changes in people's lives.
Mm. And this is the difference, isn't it? When we talk about women who are imbued with the spirit of the gospel that John Paul II talks about at the start of Mulieris Dignitatem, it's women who are tapping into, I think, humility, as opposed to what
Mhm.
feminism talks about is this
Right.
self-righteous arrogance and pride
Mm.
about I am right and
Yeah.
I will push my
Yeah.
agenda at the expense of all others. And,
Yes.
Jonathan and I have done a lot of relationships education over many years now, and we've watched lots of different marriages flourish and then those that did not flourish. And I would have to say one of the defining qualities that I see in marriages that don't go the distance isn't a lack of trust or communication or any of that. It's actually a lack of humility and a lack of
Wow.
receptivity to growth. Because if we're able to
Mhm.
come before the Lord in humility, then we can own what we are bringing to the table in any given situation.
Yeah.
That might be not just marriage, but in parenting, having the humility with our children to say, actually, I've got this wrong. Or in the
Yeah.
workplace, or in our work in ministry, like, actually, I need to have humility in all things. And I think that's one of the defining characteristics between secular feminism and as Catholic women, what we're aspiring to is to be,
Mhm.
we're not aspiring to achieve and to be like men and to grasp at what men have. Our focus
Mhm.
should be on how am I being called into the fullness of who God's created me to be as a woman. Yes, it's very
Yeah.
important.
No, I think that's great. I actually have just been really thinking about this a lot recently, just how humor is such an effective tool for both humility,
Yeah.
not teasing other people, but just sort of creating that space where people feel like um, there's safety when you can joke with someone, and you can, or be sort of
Yes,
self-deprecating about something, or
that's right.
it changes the dynamic, because so often these things can be so intense and feel so challenging. And I know in my own marriage, this has been one of the things that I think has really added a lot of levity and helped us through some very difficult periods, is just sort of the careful use of humor, again, not at the expense of someone, but just to um, kind of break that up, because
Mm.
things can feel so intense. But I think humor is also really important, just even on the family level. And I've been thinking a lot about laughter, and the laughter that happens in big family gatherings where people are joking and they have these great memories, and all of that. I think these are really important things that we can literally bring to the table,
Mm-hmm.
to create safety and create memories and create just a sense of joy and mirth, which is what we're obviously called to, um,
Yeah,
as
beautiful.
Catholics. But I think it's an important piece, because a lot of times the world is so heavy, and to sort of
Mm.
imbue that with the humility. I mean, humor is connected with that. It's, Satan doesn't joke. And we see this, the more prideful people become, and this is what's happened in the culture with comedy, is that nobody can really take jokes anymore.
No.
And so I think there's something very fundamental about that, and very Catholic, deeply Catholic, about that kind of humor. You see that in a lot of great saints too.
Yeah, beautiful. Thanks, Carrie. This has been such a great conversation. And I'm wondering if we can just end by spending a little bit of time in, I guess, this idea of what women can do, because we
Mm.
are called to action. We don't want to read your book and then just put it down or shelve it. And that was a nice
Right.
book that I read. I
Yeah.
think it actually should be a catalyst for growth and change and transformation. And as women, we do hold a unique key. And John Paul II is so big on this in Evangelium Vitae. He said it's women who hold the key to transforming culture because we
Yeah.
are the guardians of the heart, we are the gatekeepers of life, and we do occupy a unique place. So, as women, I'm interested in just talking for a couple of moments as we wrap up this episode of how and what women can actually do. I think we're
Yeah.
seeing, you touch on this in the final chapter of your book, just the explosion of pornography and the over sexualization
Mhm.
of children to the point
Yeah.
where some people are seeming a little asexual, which is
Yeah.
unhealthy as well. Um,
Super incredibly
and so
unhealthy.
there's so many moves that are happening in terms of, I guess, pornography, and we've got different ideologies infiltrating the school system. What can women do practically
Yeah.
to,
Right.
I guess, make a difference in this space?
Yeah, no, and I think that's a great question. And obviously everybody, as you mentioned at the beginning, every woman has a mission and a different way in which she can do something. I would obviously invite any women watching to sign up for Theology of Home. This is the blog that I run with Noelle Merring, and we sort of joke about it being the poor woman's magazine because we don't have millions of dollars to have our own magazine, but we pulled together, we aggregate all of this content every week, every day, actually 5 days a week, for women to read. And just it's everything from travel tips to theological discussions to things that we're interested in as women. We're very good at multitasking, and it's kind of just brings all of those things together to help us form each other,
Mm.
because it's very hard to find those kinds of resources where it feels like something fun but also engaging and really forming us. And we've seen amazing fruit in the lives of women from this blog over the last 5 years. um, but so I think that's an obviously easy thing. Find some resources that feed you, whether it's books or things online. That's important. There's also just those key pieces of paying attention and being aware of what's going on in your schools, being aware of what's going on in your relationships, trying to be the best woman that you can be, because that's going to immediately change other people around you. I mean, there's that great line about you can't change other people, you can only change yourself. But often when you change yourself, there's a ripple effect and it changes other people dramatically. So I think that's important. Um, Getting involved in things, whether it's fighting the culture on different things or building up the culture in other areas. I mean, this is Theology of Home, and this is this idea
Mm.
of how do we build up the culture. We can do basic things like ask people for dinner or invite some young women over to teach them how to make homemade pasta or a pie that we like, or very basic things that I think young people aren't always learning these skills, but it can also be this incredible opportunity to mentor women.
Yes.
I guess it just really depends on women's age and interests, but all of those things. I had this spiritual director many years ago who said every gift that we have been given is not for ourselves; it's meant to be given away, and it's actually not even our own until we give it to others.
Mm.
And I think that has just been a real like key idea, this touchstone that I always go back to is how can I share and use my gifts
Yes.
with others? And so I think that that's something that we all need to ask ourselves. But I think it's incredible what women can really do. And this is one of the reasons why feminism um, has been so damaging, because it really distorts a woman's soul and her capacities and
Yeah.
we become very turned in upon ourselves. And what a difference it makes when just even a few women start changing that and start looking at things differently. So yeah, I think between educating ourselves, figuring out what our gifts are, and really loving those around us well, that goes a long way. I loved when I lived in Italy, because one of the things that struck me about it was just how hands-on women were about hugging and loving on their children.
Mm.
There was a woman at church. I never met her. I saw her at mass, at 5 o'clock mass every night at the same parish, the same church I would go to for daily mass. And she was kind of dour faced generally. And then I would see her with children and she was just transformed. She was just
Mm.
radiant. And I remember her, watching her hug a little boy. And I mean, it was amazing what a difference that
Mm.
made. And just the face of the child that, she's looking down into his face. And maybe she was an aunt or something. I don't know who even she was in relationship to the child, but it's really stayed with me. What happens when we love people
Yes.
well and we're really focused on them
Yeah.
and love them in the way that they need to be,
Well, we're true to our
they
nature, aren't
need.
we? Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
No,
right.
it's really beautiful.
Oh, well,
It's really
look,
beautiful.
thank you, Carrie, so much for your time today. It's been just a beautiful
Oh, my pleasure.
conversation, and I really hope and pray women will take this further. I will put the link to your book in the show notes, but where can women find you? Where can they find Theology of Home?
Yeah. So Theology of Home, the blog is just theologyofhome.com. And
Mhm.
that's where you can find our books and then all the writing and work that Noelle, Mary, and I do. And Noelle does a lot with the woke culture and trying to help Catholics navigate that. And then, of course, we've got this amazing woman, Denise Troll, who is an empty nester. And she's one of these women that I just want to read everything that she writes. She used to write for another site, and I was able to pull her over to us, and she publishes at least one thing a week for us.
Beautiful.
Super wise. And then we have this woman named Emily Malloy, she's just this Martha Stewart. She knows how to arrange flowers and she bakes and she writes all kinds of recipes for us that are related to the liturgical season. And anyway, it's just we've really been growing it over the years and it's just been fun to add to it and take the gifts that these women have and hopefully we can keep doing that. I mean, that's really our goal is to keep adding to it. But that's certainly the best place to find
Fantastic.
my work and I think what's most helpful to so many women.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much. God bless you. God bless all the work that you do. And I look forward to having you back after your next book, whatever that
That
will
well,
be.
yes, hopefully not for a while, but I love it. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I hope you found that conversation to be both insightful and inspiring. If you'd like to go further with Dr. Carrie Gress's work, you can find a link to her book and Theology of Home online editorial in our show notes. In our conversation, Carrie and I roamed across a number of topics, and I'd like to shine a spotlight on 3 of these. The first is understanding, I guess, a deeper level of formation around what it means to be a Catholic woman in the world today. And I think this is an area that is really lacking in women's lives. This area of formation, being formed, being mentored in what it means to be a Catholic woman and how we are called to strive towards sainthood. So one of the courses that I'd like to draw your attention to is our online 4-part series on John Paul II's teaching on Catholic femininity and womanhood. In this course, we really deep dive into his 2 documents for women, Mulieris Dignitatem, on the vocation and the dignity of womanhood, and his letter to women. Now, he was really responding to some of the challenges of feminism, and he was calling us and elevating our gaze towards a bigger and a more rich definition of what it means to be a woman in the world today. So I really encourage you to head on over and check out that incredible resource. The second thing I'd like to draw your attention to is the Catholic Women's Masterclass. Now, the doors are now open for this masterclass, and I will only be doing one intake throughout 2024. So I want to encourage you to go and check that out now. In our conversation, Carrie and I spoke about this lack of mentoring and the lack of, I guess, support and community for women as they're trying to navigate whether it's family life or career. And the Catholic Women's Masterclass really offers women a space and a community to flourish as women. We take you through a 4-month journey of transformation where we look at rhythms of renewal. Now, Carrie and I spoke about this difference between being a woman doing and being a woman who is being. And in the masterclass, we talk about how you can establish rhythms of renewal, and we look at 4 key rhythms that will really anchor you in your life as a Catholic woman and will cause you to flourish in your relationships, your work, and your vocation. In this masterclass, we take a look at what it means to be a Catholic woman. We do an inventory of our life, what's working, what are the areas that we're called to grow in. We spend a lot of time deep diving into, I guess, how we can renew our minds in a spirit of the gospel and bring every thought captive and make it obedient to Christ. We explore our role and the evolution of our role throughout our life as women. And then we finish by looking at what is our unique vocation, mission, and purpose. What are our gifts and how are we being called to activate those gifts in service and contribution? So ladies, I would love to invite you to come and look at that masterclass. Check it out. Share the link with some of your friends because we will be kicking off just after Easter with this masterclass. Once again, the link to that is in the show notes and you can explore more on our website, www.geniusproject.co. Now, ladies, I do have a free giveaway for you in this episode, so I invite you to check that link out in the show notes. That guide is the Genius Guide to Self-Care for Catholic Women. So I'd really love for you to go and get your free copy of that resource today. Until next week, ladies, have a beautiful week. God bless you. And I look forward to you joining me again on the Genius Podcast next week.